America's Cold War, Chapter 8, Part. No. Chapter 8, A New Cold War, Part 2, The Campaign for Human Rights. Despite their diverse backgrounds, Carter, Brzezinski, and Vance had come together initially as leading members of the Trilateral Commission, a private organization founded by David Rockefeller to foster greater coordination and better relations among the three centers of world capitalism: the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. The underlying strategy of the Commission, and of the three men who took command of American foreign policy in 1977, was to de-emphasize the bipolar geopolitical conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, to regard that struggle in less urgent terms. By cultivating better relations with the Japanese and Europeans, by raising America's moral profile around the world, and by viewing the USSR as a declining, backward power that must still be contained, but no longer deeply feared. The United States could lead the industrialized world into a post-Cold War era in which management and order, rather than confrontation and rivalry, were the main business of international politics. Within this larger vision, Carter initially hoped to achieve several specific aims, including a lasting peace in the troubled Middle East and the establishment of full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. But the principal early effort was undoubtedly the administration's advocacy of human rights. Though political orators like to trace this concept back to age-old Judeo-Christian traditions, it is in fact a relatively modern proposition that emerged in a serious way only in the 20th century. Out of two bloody world wars, the conviction grew that crimes against humanity were humanity's concern. Woodrow Wilson's pronouncements endorsed this proposition, and Franklin Roosevelt, though never doubting that foreign policy must be based on calculations of national interest, believed that its ideals were an indispensable part of America's power. The United Nations Charter of 1945 pledged member nations to work to promote human rights, and 3 years later, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By then, the superpowers and their clients had already commenced bickering over the issue. The Western nations condemned the Soviet bloc for its abuse of civil and political rights. The Kremlin and its allies assailed the West for its neglect of social and economic rights. More and more, the concept became a theme in U.S. foreign policy, at least until Vietnam. A state engaged in massive aerial bombardment of an underdeveloped society could not readily claim a commitment to human rights. Its dormancy continued under Nixon and Kissinger as the two men embraced realpolitik and sought to downplay ideology as a driving factor in American foreign relations. Jimmy Carter was himself a late convert to the human rights cause, or so the evidence suggests. His 1975 memoir, Why Not the Best, makes no mention of it. And in the early months of 1976, he condemned both the Helsinki Accords, with their strong human rights theme, and the whole business of interfering in the domestic affairs of other nations. But as the campaign heated up, he shifted course. Genuine conviction no doubt played a role, but so did political expediency. Human rights, he and his aides came to realize, was the perfect counterpoint to the seeming cynicism and amoral outlook of the Nixon years. The principle tapped the finest of American traditions, that of having a mission to the world, and also spoke to pressing contemporary concerns. It promised to restore America's tarnished international image, sullied by Vietnam, Watergate, support for right-wing dictators, and CIA assassination plots. It responded to the agitation in Congress to make human rights a centerpiece of American diplomacy. Best of all, the issue could win the support of Cold Warriors, who were eager to indict the communist world for its treatment of subject peoples, and also liberal idealists troubled by America's ties to dictatorships. In the midst of a race for the White House, human rights seemed to the Carter camp like a grand unifying theory of foreign policy. The United States would act in accord with its own ideals, rather than hypocritically lauding its political liberties while bankrolling regimes that brutally suppressed them. In 1977, White House Chief of Staff Hamilton Jordan put the matter bluntly. Of our numerous foreign policy initiatives, he wrote to Carter, human rights is the only one that has a broad base of appeal among American people and is not considered liberal. Skeptics, straining to be heard over the din, pointed out that previous efforts to impose American idealism on the world had not always worked out as hoped. Wilson's grandiose plan to make the world safe for democracy after the First World War had foundered on the resistance of allies abroad and lawmakers at home. The skeptics cautioned that a human rights policy, if indeed it qualified as a policy, would be tricky to implement, and they warned that the concept could be seen around the world as ethnocentric and culture-bound, promoting a universal understanding of rights that, in fact, did not, and still does not, exist. Sure enough, in short order, difficulties arose. Diplomats griped when the human rights effort interfered with delicate arms control negotiations, while the Pentagon brass complained when it imperiled military arrangements and alliances. Treasury officials noted the implications for the nation's balance book. Trade restrictions, they said in late 1978, were costing up to $10 billion a year and increased the trade deficits. Captains of industry objected that the campaign hurt exports. In particular, bilateral relationships, Carter likewise found himself pulled in different directions. Though he was able to preside over the transfer of the Panama Canal to the government of Panama, thereby removing long-running Latin American grievances against old-fashioned Yankee imperialism, the move exacted a serious domestic political cost. Right-wing lobbyists banded together to send out a truth squad to major media markets, charging that the withdrawal gave Moscow a stronger foothold in the region, an accusation repeated by congressional hawks. Moreover, Carter ran into trouble on Nicaragua and Iran. In 1977, the administration announced that it would consider rescinding its support for these two longtime allies, both led by deeply repressive governments that had flourished as a direct assault of American sponsorship. Anastasio Somoza ran Nicaragua with an iron hand, brutally terrorizing his political opponents and keeping the population mired in poverty. In Iran, the Shah continued to reign a quarter century after being put into power by Eisenhower's coup, and to deliver on his promise to keep the oil flowing. Determined to maintain secular values in the face of growing Islamic unrest, his secret police organization, Savak, imprisoned and tortured Islamic clerics and other dissidents by the thousands, using methods and equipment provided by the CIA. Carter needed no convincing that America's association with such regimes was damaging its reputation, turning many in Latin America and the Middle East who were uninterested in communism against the United States. But he also came to see a danger in undermining them. And so the presumed number one human rights crusader could offer staunch support for the Shah and send an effusive letter of commendation to Somoza, even as his administration moved to cut off U.S. support for both of these regimes. Charges of hypocrisy flew, particularly when it became clear that the White House was holding strategically or economically unimportant countries, Paraguay, Uganda, and Cambodia, for example, to a higher standard than more important ones. China, the cynics duly noted, received no administration pressure at all. Furthermore, by threatening to cut off support for Somoza and the Shah, Carter gave political activists in those countries further reasons to seek their overthrow. When the administration discontinued military assistance and opposed loans to Somoza's regime in 1977, left-wing activists, many of them with no connections to Cuba and the Soviet Union, prepared for rebellion. In Iran, fundamentalist clerics, supported by radical students, rallied behind the Ayatollah Khomeini, who condemned Western materialism and promised to expel the corrupt Shah and establish an Islamic Republic. Carter thus confronted the dilemma that faces any leader promoting a moralistic foreign policy, with the benefits of disassociating America from the repressive regimes in Managua and Tehran. Oh, that must be in fucking Nicaragua. Would the benefits of disassociating America from the repressive regimes in Managua and Tehran outweigh the risks of anti-American movements rising to political power? The Soviet Union presented its own set of problems for the human rights campaign. Carter and Vance felt certain that U.S. foreign policy should reflect the new, more multipolar international system, but they also understood that it was still a two-superpower world. Issues remained that required negotiation and cooperation with the Soviet Union. For Vance, one such issue loomed larger than any others: arms control. The race between the United States and the USSR to acquire even more nuclear weaponry had reached the point of absurdity, he was convinced. The two sides now had some 50,000 warheads between them. It was the interest of both nations to agree to verifiable cuts, not only to avoid building expensive weapons that could make only the rubble bounce, as Winston Churchill once put it, but also to get rid of weapon systems that could destabilize mutually assured destruction. Certain kinds of nuclear weapons were clearly useful only for retaliation, but others could be used for offensive purposes. Washington and Moscow had a joint interest in preventing the proliferation of the latter. Accordingly, during their first 2 years, Vance and Carter sought to conclude a comprehensive deal with the Soviet Union that had originated during the Ford administration, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT II. They found a willing partner in Leonid Brezhnev, who was desperate to reduce military spending and who understood that arms control remained one of the few arenas in which the USSR could act as an equal. Carter, however, stung by the charges of hypocrisy, refused to abandon his criticism of Soviet human rights abuses for the sake of the treaty. He accepted a letter from the Soviet physicist and dissident Andrei Sakharov that publicly criticized the treatment suffered by Sakharov and other dissidents at the hands of Kremlin authorities. The White House also used moralistic language to denounce relatively minor Soviet involvement in the Horn of Africa, adventures that signaled no nefarious geopolitical agenda, but rather last-ditch attempts to expand its strategic reach and diplomatic influence, as great powers do. The aging and ailing Brezhnev